All right. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are from the world. Welcome to our SharePoint Embedded for Azure Developers session. We've got 3 speakers here today to walk you through all things SharePoint Embedded one-on-one for Azure developers. We've got Steve Puslik, Yogesh Ratnaparkhi, and Reed Karlberg to walk you through our agenda today.
All right.
All right.
Thanks, Calissa. Hey, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I get the honor of kicking this off today, so I'm going to walk you through a quick overview and demo. We're going to talk about the core innovation behind SharePoint Embedded, and then Steve is going to take over and teach you how to get started in 15 minutes or less. Yogesh is going to come in and talk more about copilots and agents. We have some really exciting news there. Steve is going to come back and talk about security and compliance, everybody's favorite subjects, which are absolutely key to succeeding with an enterprise app, as we all know. And then we'll talk about some next steps and handle some Q&A. So with that, I really want to kick off with a very high level of why we're here, because we have some new and interesting things to talk about. First of all, Azure today provides robust storage capabilities. If you're an Azure developer, you're used to working with these, they're great options for you. Structured data typically goes into something like SQL Server. This is something I'm sure you're all familiar with. And unstructured data is usually going, of course, into Azure Blob Store. And what we're here to talk about today is a new storage option that's specifically designed for a different kind of data. We call this data collaborative data. And so typically these are files and documents that you would store inside an M365 tenant. And SharePoint Embedded is a new way for you to do that. Collaborative data has some very interesting characteristics when you look at it. Number one, it tends to be active data as compared to data which is static. So it's data that you're working on in some way. It also tends to be interactive. In addition to not being static, it is data which is changing and you're modifying it, usually with other people, often in a multiplayer environment. It needs to be Copilot-Ready. These are typically things that you want to do RAG operations on, or you want to use LLM to inspect and understand. And of course, these need to be private, trusted, and compliant. So this type of data is key to enterprise apps of all kinds. And often you're going to see this as Word, Excel, or PowerPoint files. It can also be video, it can be PDFs, and of course it can be things like JSON or JPEG. Now, although I call out these file formats, it's important to note that collaborative data is not limited to these kind of formats. Now, when you think about use cases for something like SharePoint Embedded, there are a lot of different use cases that we're discovering as we talk to our customers. We've been GA since May at Build, and I'll be talking more about that in just a second. We're in use by companies around the world, large and small, for both line of business and ISV apps. Governments are also turning out to be early adopters, which if you have worked with governments in the past, this might surprise you. It also surprised me, but people are seeing the opportunity here with this fully global service. Now, collaborative data requires the 4 C's. And if you take one thing away from this session, I want you to take away these 4 C's. And so these are compliance, collaboration, Copilot, and core enterprise storage. And really what happens is SharePoint Embedded makes it very easy for you to deliver these requirements as part of any app that you happen to be building. So, okay. With that, I want to do a quick demo so you can see this in action and get a grounding on what it is that we're exactly talking about. I'm just going to switch over to an app I have running. You can see it's just running in localhost. I'm going to go ahead and sign in. And when I sign in, you'll see it's just popping up the regular Microsoft authentication, going over to a regular tenant. I'm going to grant it some permissions. And here I can do something called create a container. Now, don't worry, I'm going to get into more detail about what all this means in just a minute. But if I say, good morning, Azure developers, right? This will be my container name. And then you can see a couple things that are happening. So this is entirely API driven. There's no UX that's part of this. And the API calls are just standard Microsoft Graph API calls. So I've gone ahead and create a container. And now I can look and I can see it right here. And there's a lot of things that I can do with this, but I'm going to do something really basic. I'm going to go in and I'm going to upload a file. And it's going to be something that I've created on Colorado mining history. I live in Colorado. I'm fascinated by mining. So it's a great example. You can see you get the same sort of feedback from how the API is working. And if I want to now, I can go ahead and edit this file. So what you're seeing right here is the core magic of SharePoint Embedded in action. I've gone ahead and created a place to store files and documents as part of any app. I've built my own user experience for that app. And now I'm using a standard Microsoft Word session in the web to go ahead and edit this. So I can now say if I want to, hello, Azure developers, right? And just like Word clients do everywhere, it goes ahead and saves that real time. Okay, so that's a very high level demo. Don't worry, Steve's going to get into much more detail about how you can harness this, but this is really what we're talking about here today. So let me bring this back up. And now we're going to talk about the core innovation behind SharePoint Embedded. So if you think about SharePoint today, SharePoint is already a partitioned service. And so it lives inside the M365 storage subsystem, and there's two partitions that are commonly available. So these partitions are SharePoint Online and OneDrive. And so if you're used to working with these, you know that there's a security boundary between them, and you know that the user experience is different and that they have different rules. But at its core, they're using the exact same storage subsystem. And what we're introducing is this ability for you to create your own partition inside M365. And this is where SharePoint Embedded lives. You interact with it just like you saw a second ago using the Microsoft Graph API. And it has all of the same characteristics that you're used to from anything that's stored inside the M365 storage subsystem. So SharePoint Embedded is an API-only headless version of SharePoint specifically designed for apps. It lives inside that dedicated partition within your M365 tenant, or if you're an ISV, it lives within your customer's M365 tenant. And it includes all of the M365 collaboration, security, and compliance capabilities that you're used to. Remember we were talking about those 4 Cs? It has full integrated content management and control through the SharePoint Admin Center. And it's also Microsoft 365 Copilot-Ready. It is all powered by Microsoft Graph and is all delivered via consumptive APIs, Azure consumptive APIs. And of course, it includes the M365 business continuity promises that you've come to expect. Now, I did say that this was GA as of build, so as of May. And if you want to, you can go ahead and point your phone over at this QR code and read this later. There is a fantastic 2-minute explainer video on this that will help you understand at a very high level everything that SharePoint Embedded has to offer. It's also a great way to introduce SharePoint Embedded to your colleagues. So I would encourage you to go ahead and bookmark this page and take a look at it. Now, really important to note about SharePoint Embedded is SharePoint Embedded is the way that Microsoft is building our first-party apps today. So if you think about first-party apps like Designer or Loop or Copilot Pages, those are all powered by SharePoint Embedded. And so when you're building with SharePoint Embedded, you're actually using the exact same system to build your apps that Microsoft uses to build our apps. So it is all built on top of the M365 security and compliance capabilities. And of course, it's all living in the Microsoft cloud. Now, I want to talk about this problem that's out there that I think you have probably run into over time. When we started talking to people about file and document-centric apps, we realized that these files and documents are actually all over the place inside a typical enterprise. So for example, a finance app might have various accounts payable receipts or accounts receivable copies, PDFs, that kind of thing. An HR app is typically going to have a bunch of information about employees, maybe very sensitive, personally identifying information. A sales app often has customer information that's attached to it, and a work management app might have any mix of this. It might have a PowerPoint that people are collaborating on, or it might have an Excel sheet that people are working through together. And this differences, all this variety of ways and places that files and documents are stored leads to tremendous complications for modern enterprises. These are fragmented and siloed systems. They're very labor intensive to administer, and they introduce security and compliance challenges. And so what we have noticed as we start to talk to people is that there is this opportunity for a unified content platform where all of these different systems are actually storing their files and documents inside the same common system. And this is where SharePoint Embedded comes in. And the advantage of this, of course, is it delivers a consistent footprint around security, compliance, and Copilot capabilities, and also all the content management, different administration and compliance requirements that you're going to have. Now, one thing that's interesting, and Yogesh is going to talk more about this here as he gets into Copilot, is that when you think about building an enterprise AI app, there's really, kind of 3 easy steps to it. Step number 1 is you have to get all the data that you care about in the same place. Step number 2 is you have to make sure that that data is robustly secured via ACLs and compliance and rules and all the policies that an enterprise need. And step number 3 is you have to integrate that with a common set of tools that people are used to working with, things like Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. Sound familiar? It should. This is where SharePoint Embedded really shines. Now, when you think about M365 features, I've talked about that at a very high level, but this is much more detail about each one of these. So the 4 C's are across the top: Copilot, compliance, collaboration, core storage. And if we take a look at just one of these, collaboration, what's really important to note is that you have full features that you would expect to have. You can use both the web client and the desktop client. You have full co-authoring and presence support. You can do full @mentions with people who have access to the document. You get full sharing to internal and external users, and you have preview for more than 300 different file types as part of this. So when I say that SharePoint Embedded is a way for you to deliver robust M365 features for file and document management in your app, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about this degree of full featuredness. Now, Steve and Yogesh are going to go deeper on each one of these, so I'm not going to steal their thunder, but I do want you to really kind of take in and digest how complete this is. Our mission with SharePoint Embedded is to enable you, the app developer, to build exactly the app that you want, that your enterprise customers demand, with all of the file and document management features that you need. So let's talk a little bit about how this comes together. So you remember this slide from just a minute ago. So this is how we're talking about the SharePoint Embedded delivering a new partition within the M365 storage subsystem that you can interact with using Microsoft Graph APIs. This actually gives you a new construct, a completely new construct that we call SharePoint Embedded Containers. This is a new file and document management primitive that you can now harness in your apps. It's designed to be extremely lightweight, quick to instantiate, and highly scalable. You can have more than 100,000 of these per app. And I should point out that this 100,000 limit is actually a default limit. And really, it's something that we can expand quite a bit. And really what we mean is if you get more than 100,000 containers, we want to talk to you and make sure that we're helping you architect it correctly. The app has full control over the containers that it instantiates. And the way to think about these containers is that you should map them to the business construct that your app is trying to address. So for example, you might have noticed on the use case wheel that we had there, professional services is a big place where we're starting to see some early product market fit. And so for example, in the professional services arena, specifically legal services, most people there tend to map containers to a legal matter. There's a very natural mapping that is able to occur in most of these problem domains so that a container represents a business challenge that is the focus of the app. And so that's what you want to do with a container. Now, these are also a scale, unit, and security boundary. We'll talk more about those permissions in just a second. And it's important to note that you can manage these in your SharePoint Admin Center. There's a new containers section with role-based access control. And Steve's going to talk more about that as he gets into security and compliance. So let's talk about containers for just another minute. You should know that they're strongly typed. They're strongly typed to whatever app has created them. So if app 1 is out here using SharePoint Embedded Containers, and app 1 has a stack of containers that it's working with, only app 1 can access those containers by default. I want to say that again. Only app 1 can access app 1 containers by default. Now, It is, of course, possible for you to develop a microservices architecture where maybe you have a common set of containers that are accessed by many apps, but the default is that you could only have the app that created those containers managing those. And so you can see that app 1 has its own stack, app 2 has its own stack, and app 3 has its own stack. This is an important characteristic of SharePoint Embedded, so I want to make sure that people understand it. Now, when you're talking about ISV apps, they have an additional construct, which is really interesting. And it's an additional way of operating really more than anything. And so if you see the ISV tenant over here on the left-hand side of the slide, they go ahead and strongly type a particular set of containers to work with their app. And then when they're working with their customers, whether it's customer 1, 2, or customer N, there's no upper limit. When they're working with their customers, those customers can actually use that same strongly typed container within their M365 tenant. So the core ISV component that you want to take away from this is that when an ISV is using SharePoint Embedded, it's actually interacting with containers that live in their customer's M365 tenant. And so they inherit their customer's M365 configurations. Okay. Permissions, very important. Now, on the permissions front, of course, these apps can't just work inside any tenant. The customer or the admin has to make sure to grant each app OAuth perms to work inside their tenant. And this is true whether it's an ISV app or an LOB app. We've introduced a new permission scope in Graph to handle this, and it's called file storage container.selected. Now, our mission is to encapsulate all the permissions inside file storage container.selected. There's still a couple things that we're working through. So generally speaking, this works, but there's a couple things that we want to do around search that are still a work in progress. So we should talk about that. Importantly, you can have app only and app plus user permissions. Almost everything is available to app plus user, and then there are several things which are available to app only construct. When the admin is actually granting permissions, they're granting that app access to its containers and contents. But it's a very narrow permission scope, really. It's really designed to be just for that app and its content, and is designed to not leak beyond that, to be a least privileges situation. Now, there are ways, as we said before, for you to grant other apps permission to those containers. And so if that's something you're looking for, we have some rich documentation on how to do that. Now, I want to talk for just a second about the permission model for users, because one of the things that's different about SharePoint Embedded is that you have a deterministic permissioning model that doesn't inherit from anything else. So at the container level, you have this notion of permission roles. So for example, a user could be a reader, a writer, a manager, or an owner at the container level. And you could assign users or groups. Now, likewise, at a particular file or folder level, you can also add permissions for users or groups there. It's designed to be a very flexible sharing model. So you can have a bunch of app-specific settings, including things like enabling external sharing or not. And you can also make sure that you are restricting this to your app, or that sharing could be outside of your app. So you have a lot of flexibility there. Now, one of the core interesting things about SharePoint Embedded versus SharePoint Online is that if you're used to working with SharePoint Online, you will probably have some experience with SharePoint Online resource units. And what we've done with SharePoint Embedded is we've taken the highest number of resource units for SharePoint Online, and then we've doubled them. And so if you're thinking about what type of constraints you need to work within for this cloud service, just like with any cloud service, you actually have a substantially increased allocation of these resource units for every API call. So again, it's double the highest configuration on SharePoint Online. Now, we have 2 great articles on this, and so if you're interested in diving in, you can definitely find those, and we can paste those into chat and comments for you as well. Now, we often get asked this question, is when to use which document management approach. And it's like any great architecture question. You end up with this solid answer of it depends. And so we just put 3 different approaches here. So there's Azure Blob Store, SharePoint Online, and SharePoint Embedded. And if you think about when Azure Blob Store is important, first of all, it's really important to know that it's a rock solid cloud object store. If you've used ABS, you know this. It is outside of the M365 security and compliance boundary. And so when you're thinking about what solution to choose, that's a very important consideration when you're working with files and documents in an enterprise context. SharePoint Online is a great option. It does include the standard SharePoint Online user experience. It has integrated security, so as part of the SharePoint Online system, and it is inside the M365 security and compliance boundary. It also delivers compliance for licensed M365 users. So it gives you a lot of capabilities. It also restricts that to a license. So it's a different kind of usage than you might have with SharePoint Embedded. So SharePoint Embedded has partition security. Nothing has access to any SharePoint Embedded containers unless you are specifically granting access. You build your own user experience. It does not include a user experience as part of it. It's a completely headless, API-only service. It has very lightweight containers. On the SharePoint Online front, there's a number of features in there that might be important to you. So things like lists, for example. That's not something which is available as part of SharePoint Embedded because SharePoint Embedded is really focused on file and document management. It has that dedicated resource allocation that I was talking about just a second ago. So if you're building an intensive app, SharePoint Embedded gives you your own stack of resource units to work against, and it's twice what the highest allocation is, the highest shared allocation is across SharePoint Online. And this is also living inside the M365 security and compliance boundary. Finally, I want to call out that this is both separately metered and it includes collaboration capabilities for both M365 licensed users and unlicensed users, people who might not have an M365 license but still need to be part of your compliance capabilities. Sorry, of your collaboration capabilities. Okay, and I think that is it. Before we move on to Steve, Calista, do we have any questions in the background that we should be answering or not yet?
Not yet.
Okay, perfect. Well, if you have questions, go ahead and put them into the chat. I'm going to take a pause. I'm going to turn it over to my good friend, Steve Puselek, who's going to walk you through how to get started in 15 minutes.
All right. Let me switch screens here. Excellent. Thank you, Reed. All right. So what Reed set up is or framed up for us is the ability to create SharePoint embedded containers and really what that is. What we're going to do now for the next 15 minutes, literally, is I'm going to show you one slide as opposed to the 31 slides that Reed set us up for. And then we're going to dive into specifically how to do that. We are going to get into specifically what is the Visual Studio Code plugin, how are we going to enable that within your environment, and how do we use it. So by the time that we're finished, we will have a fully functioning SharePoint embedded app registration in Azure. We will have a container type that has been activated and visible in the SharePoint Admin Center, and we will create a container that is going to be used to upload files and interact with your applications. We're going to also go through all the plumbing, what was created, so that from a governance perspective, from an admin perspective, you're comfortable in what is going to be included in that tenant. And also we will get the postman collection and hit the container itself so that you can see that in action and how to start to work with the API that we have. Okay, so that is my one slide, and I'm going to bail on the deck, and we're going to get specifically into Visual Studio Code. So you'll notice that I am in Visual Studio Code. The first thing that we need to do is within the extensions, simply type in SharePoint Embedded, and you're going to see.
We can't quite see your screen yet.
Darn it, I thought that. Oh, I stopped sharing.
There you go.
And I should have just, yep, I got it.
Live demos, everybody, live demos.
Live demos. I love the live demo. All right, so back to the live demo. Again, I am in Visual Studio Code. Within Visual Studio Code, the extensions section is where we're going to focus. Simply search for SharePoint Embedded, and you will have the ability to install that extension within Visual Studio Code. That will get you the icon on the side rail that will allow you to log into your environment. So if you're playing along at home, make sure that you do have that installed, and it's really nothing more than just installing the extension. Okay. Once you have the extension installed, then you're going to log into your environment. So this is where in your SharePoint online environment, simply log in with the SharePoint admin or the SharePoint embedded admin. So those are two roles that we're going to talk about here in a second. Once you're logged in, you'll notice down at the bottom, you're going to see the environments that we have created. So I've got a number of environments that I've already created. We'll dive into one of them here quickly. So you can see the container type that I have created. So that container type, think of that as the collection of containers that we're going to use for your applications. So within that container type, now we have the ability to see the containers. Now, these are going to be a number of different containers that you can create to store your documents. That's the heart and soul of SharePoint Embedded, is those containers, the ability to store documents in those containers so that you can surface those in your application and have users interact with those. Okay, so what we're going to do is on the root of container types, I'm going to collapse everything. This is where we're going to create a trial container type. So once we create that trial container type, this is going to be active for 30 days. And you can, there's no subscription needed for this, no consumption needed for this. It's simply a way for you to start to kick the tires on what that needs to, components that you need to create that. So you'll notice that I clicked on that create container type, trial container type, and I'm going to type in what the name is. So SPE Super Session AM, and I'm going to hit go. Okay, so now I want to create that Azure SharePoint Embedded Application app. So once I click on that, now it's creating that Entra ID app. So you'll see the status of the creation progress happening down in the bottom right-hand corner. The next thing we want to do is we want to register that on our local tenant. So yes, we do. It's opening up the consent link. So this is where, and I'm going to grab this guy and pull it down on the window. Log in again with that global administrator, SharePoint administrator, so that you can get access to those permissions that were requested. So Reed had mentioned that we need to get the file storage containers and the user profile information. So this is what we're accepting that permission request to do. Have the ability to create that within your Azure environment. And now we're going to go back to Visual Studio Code. And now it's going to continue on. So now it's registering that container type on our local tenant. Once that's registered, again, we're going to see what this has done for us automatically, and it's successfully registered. So now that we have that successfully registered, I can go back to our container types. I'm going to do a refresh there. It's going to show up here in just a second. But what happened is if we go into the SharePoint Admin Center, and I'm going to grab that here. So within the SharePoint Admin Center, you will notice that on the left-hand side, we have typical SharePoint sites and the archive sites and so forth there. But we've also got that new vertical called containers. And if we go into containers, now we can start to see all of the containers that we have within our environment. Okay. So right now, the one that we've created, not there yet, but what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the container types that we have created. And I'm going to expand this out. And we should be seeing our demo tenant here in just a second. Oops. Okay, so I'm delicately killing time here until the containers show up. And let's see. Okay, so I'm going to kill Visual Studio Code really quick. I'm going to fire that guy up again. And we're going to reconnect just to make sure that we have no latency because of the screen sharing. Okay, so back to my Visual Studio SharePoint Embedded plugin. I'm going to go ahead and sign into my account. Go. So I'm going to get prompted for my credentials. So again, this is where I'm going to have my username and password there. Signing in as, again, that global administrator or the SharePoint admin. Okay, great. So now you can see that my new container type called SPE Super Session has been created, but I don't have any containers in it yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right mouse click on the containers and I'm going to hit that create container. And again, I'm going to go up to the Visual Studio Code command bar, type in what I want that name of the container to be, and it's going to create that container for me automatically. Once that's created, it's going to get refreshed. And we're going to see that in our containers option within Visual Studio Code. But as I go back to SharePoint Admin Center, I'm going to do a refresh on this guy now. And within my active containers, I'm going to see my SharePoint Embedded app. And here is my SharePoint AM session. So now we have that been created. Once we have that created, now we can start to interact with it. But the first thing we need to do is create permission so that users can get access to that container. So if I simply, in the Admin Center, click on that container that I want to grant permissions to, you'll see we've got a bit of overview on what the metrics are for the container. But I'm going to go in and I'm going to add an owner to that container. So now I'm going to go into the GAL, the Global Access List, or Entra ID. I'm going to find that person that has the ability to be the owner of that container. And now I've been added there. If I go back, I can start to see and add more people based on what role they want to play within the container itself. Also, if I go to settings, you'll notice that I can also set that sensitivity label. So we'll get to that here in a bit from a compliance perspective on what sensitivity labels have been published in Purview and how we can use that. But then if I go back, you can see that now I've got my owner that's been assigned to that container, and they have the ability, again, to add files, do anything that they want to for that container. All right, so that is the nuts and bolts of creating that container and container type. But you'll notice that if I go back to the Visual Studio Code, we're going to refresh that. And while that's refreshing, what we're going to do is let's take a look at what it actually created. So from a admin perspective, yes, we can see that it's in the SharePoint Admin Center and all is fine and well there. But if we go into Azure, there's a few more things that we need to focus on. When a container type is created, under the hood, it also creates the app registration in Azure. So you'll notice that I'm going to sort this by today. And here's the one that we just created. So the SharePoint Embedded app. If I go into that app registration, a few key things that we want to identify here. From an authentication perspective, this is where we are going to put in any redirects that your application may use. So when we get into Postman here in a second, this is where it's going to authorize that callback, and you'll be able to authenticate properly within your application. Certificates and secrets. So this is the secret that you're going to use within your application. So when you create that client secret, and we haven't created one yet, that is going to be critical. So the client ID and the client secret are what you're going to use in your application to authenticate, get that token so that you can start to interact with that container. And last but not least is the API permissions. So Reed had touched on this a little bit. This is where the file storage container.selected is going to be configured both with delegated and application permissions. Okay, so we'll dive into that here in just a bit. Also important to know that we need to grant admin access for those. And you'll notice that the Visual Studio Code plugin did that for us as well. Okay. All right. So the last thing that we need to do is we need to create that client secret. So you can go into the Azure app registration and do that, or I'm going to go back to Visual Studio Code, and you'll notice that now within that container that we've created, I can create that app registration. Okay. So if I right mouse click here, I can go to credentials and I can generate that new client secret. I can generate a new self-signed cert and so forth. So if I generate that secret, it's created that secret. So that's all fine and dandy. Now I can copy the secret. Okay. So it's going to save it to your clipboard. So if we copy that secret, make sure that you store that safe place, obviously, because when we go into your application, if you go into Postman, we're going to need that client ID and the client secret to authenticate properly. We're going to see that here in about 30 seconds. Okay. The next thing you can do is you can set up that Postman collection. So this is where you can download a pre-configured Postman environment. It has all the environment. It has all the workspace that you need in there to authenticate through. So let's go there really quick. And if I go into, let's see, Postman is here. Okay, so when you download that Postman collection, you're going to get an environment very similar to what we have here. So in the environment, you're going to have predefined variables on how you're going to authenticate into your app or your container type that we just created. The most important ones are that client ID and that client secret. Again, those are going to be in Visual Studio Code that you can copy those. Once you have those copied into your environment, you'll notice that we have that SharePoint embedded container. First thing we want to do is authenticate through. So you go to the authentication tab. Again, client ID, client secret. You hit that generate new token. It's going to authenticate you with the global admin, the SharePoint admin, or the owner that you have put into that container type. That's the token that we're after. Okay, so I'm going to use that token. It's going to store that in my environment. And now I can simply start to work with the Graph API and hit that container type. So you'll notice that container type is going to be a variable that you're going to want to store. But now you can start to see what are all the containers that are in there. Oh, live demos. Okay, so one more time here, and then I will call it. Yep, I selected the wrong person. Proceed with that, use that token. I'm going to go back, I'm going to list that containers, and there she blows. Okay, so now I'm getting the graph response that lists all the containers that are in my environment for that container type that we created. And now, we won't exhaust all of the commands that are going to be used within your application, but those are the ultimate where we want to be. And how we get there, easy enough within Visual Studio Code. Use the plugin, create that trial container type. When we get to creating a standard container type, there's some other PowerShell scripts and Graph APIs that we can use to do that. But this gets you going. within, the last, that probably took more than my 15 minutes here, but now you have an environment that you can start to create within your application, upload the documents, and start to get familiar with that API that will propel your application to success. Okay. All right. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Reed, and we were going to continue on here.
Hey, this is great. So, Steve, before we go on, I have one question for you.
Yes, sir.
First of all, I love live demos. I love everything about live demos, even when they go a little bit wrong. So I was glad to see that, the security worked. If you log in as Microsoft, you don't see it. If you log in as the appropriate user, you see everything just fine. That's great. Now, when you started off with this, you made the choice to demo the SharePoint Admin Center and add an owner, that kind of thing. Is that something that every user always has to do, or is that also available via API?
Yeah, excellent question. So within the API, you'll notice that I have the ability to create a new container. Does what you think it does, right? So if I create that container, then in the body, it's going to ask me two questions. What's the display name and what's that description? That's going to be used in the display within SharePoint Admin Center. Okay. If we wanted to create permissions on that container, again, another API call. You'll look at the body of that, and now you have the ability to determine what role they want to play and that user principal name. So remember, that person on Microsoft.com or a tenant user is going to be used there, or an M365 group, whatever preference you want there. But again, two ways of doing it. If you're API driven, which this is an API application and platform, great. There's an API to do that. Know that from a SharePoint Admin Center, there's some functionality coming there. If you're an admin, not quite comfortable with the API, still ways of accomplishing it there.
Excellent. So this really goes to show the depth of the capabilities for SharePoint Embedded across both API services and more traditional admin services. And it also shows the different ways that API permissions can work. So we talked about app only or app plus delegated, and in app only, it does not automatically set the owner. In app plus user, the delegated, it does automatically set the owner to whoever created it. So it really is an interesting, flexible system for developers. Okay, now with that, go ahead.
That's going to be really important too, Reed, when we get to talking about purview and the audit log on why delegated permissions are going to be there. I'll hold that little teaser for a few minutes. How's that?
Perfect. Foreshadowing the mark of a quality webinar, a quality super session. All right. With that, I want to invite Yogesh to the stage here. Yogesh, do you want to take over sharing and teach us a little bit about Copilot and agents?
Absolutely, Reed. So thank you for setting up the stage and building the context on how to build applications on SharePoint Embedded. So my name is Yogesh, and I will show you how you can bring the power of Copilot within your SharePoint Embedded applications. We believe that every app will be an AI app. And what we also believe that this is the opportunity for us to truly empower our end users and our customers to do really, really great things. And enterprise AI is that place where we can deliver real values to the end users. So let's take an example of an enterprise AI app. Contoso Audit is a software as a service. They have built their application on SharePoint Embedded. They've harnessed the power of Microsoft 365 with the collaborative, compliant storage enabled with SharePoint Embedded. Now, they want to embed a smart agent that will help the audit professionals to serve their customers and clients more effectively. So they need this agent to reason over the relevant knowledge. And there are three things that an application developer needs to build such an agent. The first thing is that the agent needs to scope the responses from the AI to the client's case. So the relevancy is really the key here. The second thing is the cited information and knowledge must be scoped to what the user has access to. So the responses need to be permission aware. And the third thing is, as the models are working on this data, the developer wants to make sure that this data does not go outside of the compliant boundaries, right? So the data needs to stay within the customer's tenancy. And we speak with a lot of customers and partners every day, and we see this across all of our customers across different sectors, whether it's legal, audit, finance, and healthcare. The common theme we see here is the need to empower the end users by harnessing the power of Copilot, power of agents, but ground them on collaborative, compliant data and make sure that the application AI promises the customer's compliance needs. So that's a common need to enable compliant AI to our customers and end users. And what we believe is the next generation of AI apps require a new type of document management system. Reed mentioned how there is a need to have a unified content platform. And there is yet another need to make this work for AI scenarios. So if you think about a typical enterprise application, they have three types of data. One is the structured data. This includes transactions and records. And then there is unstructured data, whether it's logs and images and other storage. And then the third one, which is the unstructured collaborative data. This includes the files and documents. We believe that we have a really strong solution within Azure for the structured data or unstructured non-collaborative data, if you will. For the unstructured collaborative data, including Office docs, the AI application have some unique needs. They obviously need to be RAG ready. They needs to be enabled for retrieval augmented generation to make the AI responses contextual and relevant. But they also need to be compliant. As Reed mentioned, the block storage is a solid storage for your unstructured data, but it stays outside the M365 compliant boundaries. So having not just the files, but also the semantic index, which is part of the knowledge now, within the compliant boundary of the customer is really important. The third thing is the application needs to have full scope over this knowledge. That way, it can make it relevant based on what the user is trying to seek with the AI responses. And last but not least, these responses need to be permission aware. We often see app developers building their own permission layer on top of their AI application. And while that works great, in the short term, it's not really sustainable to keep up with all the compliant needs that are that kind of grow as your application scales to different customers. And that's where SharePoint Embedded comes in. As you build your applications, you need a middle layer that checks all the boxes for building an enterprise AI application. As Reed mentioned, the containers in SharePoint Embedded are already part of the Microsoft 365 tenancy. So you get all the foundational enterprise AI needs, including the compliant boundary, the responsible AI, but you get this amazing middle layer, which is application scoped, it is permission aware, and it is semantically indexed. And with her SDK, which I'll show you through a quick demo, you also get the UX part of it. With an out-of-box agent SDK, you can plug a Copilot like chat experience within your application. The thing is, the same data layer or this middle layer is also enabling our first-party agents. So Copilot pages, declarative agents, loop agents, these are just some of the examples of how they were leveraging the power of a SharePoint Embedded to enable compliant and collaborative AI within their applications. That way, they don't have to worry about the underlying needs for a compliant AI. Whether it's your app or our first-party app, they can now focus on the user experience, the custom skills, the vertical knowledge, and eventually even their own models. So let's see this to a quick demo of how you can plug a Copilot agent within your application with just a few lines of code. So let me switch screens and bring you to the demo screen. All right, making sure my application has not timed out. Okay, that looks good. All right, so what you're looking at is a sample application I built on top of SharePoint Embedded. So this application is meant for tax professionals to serve their enterprise tax customers. And this application is organized around a tax year. So I created a container for 2024 tax year. As a tax professional, I'll be helping with my customers for this tax year. And I have curated a set of documents. And if you want to think about all the knowledge that is required for me to serve my customer, whether it's the latest regulations or the customer specific data, that's all stays within this particular container. This gives me a secure security boundary for my application. Now, this is a standard SharePoint embedded application, but what you see on the right side is an agent. This agent helps me to serve my clients even more effectively because now I can harness the power of Copilot to reason over this knowledge. You will notice that it looks like Copilot, but it is rebranded to your application. So you'll see that the title says tax agents. There are certain starter prompts that help me get started. And the tone of the chat is also set to being a tax professional, which I can do through a few lines of code that I'll show. So let me type a simple question here. So summarize tax changes for employers. So what it is doing here, it is reasoning over data within this particular container because I have set the scope to be this application. And this SDK lets you choose the scope. You could narrow it down to a single file, a folder, a container, or a set of container. You could set the scope to all the containers within your application dynamically based on your need. You will notice that the agent has summarized the response based on my query, and it used the knowledge within this particular container. So there is a citation here, which is really key for enterprise AI application because users need to know the evidence on where this data came from, right? So this is really powerful when delivering true value to the end user, like we discussed. I can also use some advanced skills here. So I could say tabularize these changes with respect to 2023. So I'm on a call with my client and I want to quickly inform them on what has changed this year versus the last one. All right, so looks like there is something wrong with my live demo, but you can see that it can tabularize the responses here. Now, enabling this agent within your SharePoint embedded application is really easy. So let me take you to the Visual Studio Code based on how easy it is to bring that. So switching screens one more time, then trying to find my Visual Studio Code here. So Steve showed you the extension for SharePoint Embedded. And once you have a container, you can load a sample app. And this sample app will let you get the SDK that you need to think my container. Yeah. So when you load the sample app, You also get an SDK here that can easily plug the agent that you just saw with just a few lines of code. So this chat control lets you set a few basic properties. So first thing, you get to set a data. So first you need to set the authorization context here. And then you get to set the data control. So remember that you need to provide the scope for your application. All right, now I get the right one. So here you get to set the auth provider and then set all the notifications and events that you need for this auth. And then you get to set the data sources for your chat control so that you can hone the responses based on a particular file or a set of containers. Okay, switching back to the content here. It's really easy for you to enable this control within your application, right? You get to set the 0 prompts, you can set the data sources, and then you are ready to enable this Copilot experience within your application. So how does this really work? So if you think about Microsoft 365 Copilot, there are really 3 steps that go into responding to the user's query. The first step is to pre-process the query that we get from the user to make sure that this query is appropriate for the user and the user has access to even asking this kind of question. So there's kind of a pre-processing that goes here. Then you send this query to the LLM where there is also an RAI check that happens. And then the third step is where it does the grounding. So the citation that you saw during the demo, this is where it checks if the user has access to this particular data, and it uses graph to make sure the access rights here. And this is where SharePoint Embedded comes in, because SharePoint Embedded is already part of that graph. So all the vector embeddings and the security trimming is done for the SharePoint Embedded, just like it is done for SharePoint as well. And you can utilize this functionality today. It's in preview. You can enable this control with the SDK that you just saw, and you can dynamically contextualize your Copilot agent responses within your application. So there is a link that you can use to start learning about this control and has all the instructions to get started. Now, what you saw is a part of our MVP. So this is a pro code SDK that lets you plug an agent within your application. As we expand, we see a world where you get a full spectrum of this agent experience. So we believe in enabling a low code experience as well, where you could use Copilot Studio to choose SharePoint Embedded as your knowledge source and publish it to your application, which could work for many scenarios where you don't need a dynamic setting of your scope. And on the right side, we envision a pro code, more advanced configuration using Copilot SDK or Agent SDK, where you can use multiple sources, not just SharePoint Embedded for your unstructured collaborative data, but also blend that with structured data and metadata and many other sources that make a meaningful experience for your end user. And all of these will be offered through a consumptive billing model, just like we do for the core SharePoint Embedded platform. So today we are in public preview. We are in private preview, and we are targeting to go to public preview next year with APIs and consumptive billing. And then we plan to go GA towards the later half of next semester. And then later half of the year, we plan to extend this functionality with advanced functionalities using Copilot Studio and Azure AI Studio. So to wrap this, what we advise our customers or developers who are exploring this is to make it real, to use this SDK to build something, show it to your customers, stakeholders, and seek to add real value. Experimentation is the key when building this AI application. So build something, but also take the feedback to iterate your roadmap. And lastly, we are here to help you. We want to collaborate with you to build truly amazing AI applications. To get started today, here is the link and reach out to us if you have any questions.
Hey, Yogesh, that's great. Thank you so much for walking us through all that. You know, one of the things that really stands out to me, and I'm curious your experience, because you've talked to so many customers about this at this point, is as you look at the complexity of doing all this from scratch, the vector database, trying to figure out compliance, trying to make sure the stuff isn't, you know, like overly broad. What kind of feedback do you get from customers when they hear that you can actually just kind of do this integrated with SharePoint Embedded?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. First thing is the scoping of it, right? That scoping, as I mentioned, is one of the most important part of it. And when they learn that the user can only access the data that they have access to, I think that relieves them a lot. I think that's one of the feedback or question we get. The second part is about the billing. So I talked about the consumptive billing. That's something that we are planning to launch next year. And that is a big part of their application design, because they need to build such that they optimize the tokens and what the cost of it is. If it's an ISV, then who they should send the bill to. Should they take the cost and include it as part of their subscription? And if it is a line of business, is it going to be part of the Copilot licenses? Or if it is consumptive, what kind of consumptive billing it is going to be. So those are kind of the next set of questions that we get. And the third one, which is more common, is around programmatic access. So what we have today is a chat-based experience, and many of our customers need a more flexible access to Copilot. So the API part is another thing, and that has all informed our roadmap, as you saw earlier, right? Yeah.
Got it. Okay, that's great. So I'm hearing that customers love the convenience of having everything together, and they look forward to us being able to provide the same flexibility around Copilot with SPI as we do with the rest of SPI and the Microsoft Graph APIs. That's what I'm hearing. Does that sound about right?
That's exactly right.
That's awesome. Well, this is great to see, and I'm excited now to turn it back over to my good friend Steve to talk about collaboration, security, compliance, all of these things which really help make this real. Steve, are you ready to walk us through this next step?
Yes, sir. All righty.
All right.
So I'm going to reshare, and we should have my deck now. And let me get these fun faces out of the way. Great. All right, so what we're going to focus on now, darn it, I hit that wrong button again. Okay. That delete button and the maximize button are just too close, right? Okay. All right, so what we're going to focus on is collaboration and compliance. And we're going to break that down into a number of different aspects. First of all is the collaboration aspects that you get within the SharePoint Embedded environment. And Reed alluded to this pretty early on with regards to within your application, focus on the business logic of your application, right? Don't focus on the storage of documents. Yes, we need to store the documents. We're going to store those in containers that we talked about earlier. But this Office integration, this is what users expect is when I open up an Office document, I want the full Office experience. And getting that is, it could be a little challenging if you're using some add-in components or other third-party application plugins and so forth, but it doesn't really meet the need of what users are looking for. Again, what is that full Office experience in your application? And that's what we're going to dive into now, is what we're talking about is true collaboration, co-authoring, the ability to @mention people, comments, version control, sharing, all of the good stuff that is in that Office experience that you get within the application, and is going to be super simple for you as developers to incorporate that. All right, so I'm going to bail out of the deck quickly, and we are going to get into what does that look like. All righty. what I have created is a Power App that will allow us to interact with the SharePoint embedded environment. So you'll notice that Reed had a React or an application that he created. Yogesh had a React component. I've got a Power App. All of the, again, bring your own interface into the solution that you want to use is fantastic. You'll see the containers that I have created, but if I go to the files portion, now you can see I have the ability to select what container I want to use, and I see the documents that are in that container. From a development perspective, the only thing that the user is going to do is click on that link. So when I click on that link, it's going to open that document in the Office experience. So we're going to let that pop here in a second. And a Word document is a Word document is a Word document. And you'll notice that, hey, this is the full Office experience. We have the ability to do app mentioning, share the document. If we wanted to open this in the client experience, we can open it in the client's experience as well. Okay, so from a user perspective, that's all they're doing. They're simply clicking on the document. They're going about their collaboration needs as they normally would. Okay, so that's huge. No configuration required on your part. But let's take a deeper look into how that works. So I'm going to go back to Postman really quick, and I'm going to go in and get some files. So if I use the list items graph API call, you'll notice that now I have to supply what's the container that I want to use. And when I go and execute that call, you'll notice that I'm going to get a laundry list of all of the files and folders that are in that container. But what I'm focusing on is this web URL attribute. Okay, so you'll notice that the web URL attribute is everything that you as a developer needs to incorporate that into your application. Okay, so just wrap that through a hyperlink, put it on the page, and all is well. Okay, so that is the focus that you're going to want to use to incorporate that in from the collaboration experience. Okay. You also have the ability, there's another API call that you can go and call for the version control. So here I've got version history that I've included in the application. A simple graph response pulls that back and includes that into your application. So use that as you need to. When you save that document, so I'm going to go back in here really quick and collaborate on the document, invite 100 of your best friends to do the same thing, all is well. You'll notice that there's auto saving happening just as you would suspect. So that's going to save it back to the container, create those versions if it's a version event. But if I go to the location, so some people are going to get smart and they're going to say, well, wait a second, I can go in the back door and I can see the contents of that library, right? Well, if I click on that particular item, you'll see that now I have an access denied error. So again, no direct access to the container or the contents. It's all sealed, meaning that you need to interact with that through the graph calls that you're going to use in your application. But know that all of the functionality of saving that back to the container, versioning, all that happens automatically as well. Okay. All right. So I'm going to proceed on a little bit further and talk about sensitivity labels. So within this document, so now we're getting into the purview in the compliance portion of it, meaning that you have the governance set up within your environment. You've got sensitivity labels deployed. You've got the configuration that you're using with multiple data sources. So this could include SharePoint, include OneDrive, Teams, anywhere that you can apply sensitivity label. There's some governance folks that have determined what those sensitivity labels are, what the configuration should be, and how they should be applied. We have a white paper that Microsoft has published on how we deployed those. We'll make sure that you have that. But from our perspective, notice that if I go to that sensitivity label icon within Word, I have that highly confidential sensitivity label that's been applied. Okay, so SharePoint Embedded, again, respects the document, respects that sensitivity label, and allows you to apply it to that particular document. All right, so let's back into this really quick. And I'm not going to drain everything within sensitivity labels, but what I want to do is I want to show you when I created that sensitivity label and I hit the edit button here, we are going to go in and we have the ability to control a lot of different aspects. One of those aspects is how do we want people to share and collaborate with that document. So when I create that sensitivity label, the one thing that I want to make sure that I enable is that files and other data assets. So that includes SharePoint and SharePoint Embedded, okay? And you'll also see that the group and sites, SharePoint sites. And if we look really close at what that URL was when we pulled it out of that Postman response, kind of looks and feels like a SharePoint URL. So, which it kind of is. Okay, so that's where we are starting to focus on SharePoint sites in this case. And this is going to be relevant here for a couple other examples that we talk about in a second. Just for clarity, I put on some controlling access who can view the labels and content marking. So in content marking, we can put highly classified on the watermarks or header of the document, whatever the case is there. But now comes the important part, which is where I can assign permissions to this particular sensitivity label that we're going to apply. In this case, the permissions that I have configured, and I can choose which users and groups and all the fun stuff that have within your organization. But in this case, I kept it pretty simple, but I assigned that viewer permissions. Okay, so if I am in a specific group, then those viewer permissions are going to apply. And we're going to see that work here in just a second. Okay, so that is how you would start to configure what the permissions are for that particular sensitivity label. And again, I added some watermarking on top of the header here so that it's very visible to what that looks like. So it stands out, gets people noticed, right? That's all I've done with this sensitivity label. I published that. And if I go back into another user, okay, so here's another user that has diminished privileges. So I've logged in a private browser with another user. I'm back to my files container or my project documents container. And if I click on that project governance template, now it's going to take a little different look and feel. Word's going to come up as we would suspect. But what I have the ability to do is severely limited. I put in viewer permissions. That's what I expect the user to do is view that document. So you'll see my highly confidential sensitivity label, highly confidential based on what I had put in for a watermark in that sensitivity label, appears on the document. Great. I'm going to go and I'm going to try and share this. So I'm going to put in an external email address, right? It's going to resolve, all is good, but hey, I can't send that, okay? So now it's using the configuration of that sensitivity label and saying, wait a second, this is highly confidential, that this can't go out to external folks, okay? Again, demonstrating that SharePoint Embedded honors the content of the document, it honors the settings of the document, as we can see from that sensitivity label. So another way of layering on security, in addition to the access that people have to the container, you can now get down to the document level and secure that according to the content of the document that is applied by the owner. So as I'm drafting it, I know this is highly confidential, put that sensitivity label on it, all is well. Okay. All right, I'm going to move on a little bit to the next topic, which is going to be audit logging. Okay, so audit logging, another big area that you can use within Purview. We'll see my one slide here on what the audit log looked like, but let's go see how that happens in action. So if I go to, again, I'm back in Purview. This time the solution that I'm selecting is the audit log. Brings me up to the audit log. And if you're familiar with the audit log, you can start to slice and dice this by date and time, workloads. There's all kinds of workloads that go into the consolidated audit log. What we're going to focus on is the file, folder, or site. Okay, so remember that site terminology from what we talked about earlier. Really quick, I'm going to go back to Postman, and you will notice that when I go to list that container, I have I'm sorry, I'm going to get the drive. You'll notice that that web URL has the URL to my tenant, content storage. Think of that as a managed path if you're in the SharePoint terminology. And then that CSP, blah, 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 that is the container that we're after. Okay, so this is my container, the name of the container, that's the URL that we're after. All I simply do is I can plug that into that site, and then I can specify the SharePoint workload. Okay, so if I specify that SharePoint workload, and then I put in, yep, still in the, I can focus this audit search on that container. Or I can focus that audit search on all containers. Okay, so wildcards do work as you would suspect there. And as soon as we execute that search, you can see that I've got a number of searches that I've completed down below. If I go into the SBE search all items, so I did this for about a week or so time, and you can see that now here is typical audit log information. What's the activity that I'm doing? I'm uploading files. I did a lot of file work lately. I modified the folder, created some permissions, access to file. So if I click into that access to file, who did what? Okay, so here's where somebody went in, access to file. I can get all of the metadata information, organization, everything that I needed from there. Okay, so again, full audit log capabilities, as you would suspect, for a number of the activities. And if we, we can go in and see all the activities, or you can specify specific activities as it's being executed within the audit log. Okay. All right, so that is the audit log. Create new searches as you need to. Surface that within your applications. There's some graph endpoints that you can do to retrieve those search names and display those as well. All right, last thing I want to cover is e-discovery. So again, I'm going to go into my solution for e-discovery. And I've got a couple of cases that I have created. One case that I created was SharePoint Embedded, naturally. The specific part, we won't walk through everything, but where I want to focus is on the data sources that we want to use within this case. As this comes up, you'll see that I have a data source that's created, but if I add a new data source, it's a SharePoint site, edit the SharePoint sites, I'm going to paste in that URL that we got from our graph endpoint, simply include that in our e-discovery case. Once you include that in your e-discovery case, I'm going to bail here. It's going to go and it's going to fully index that. It's going to apply a litigation hold on that container. So if you go to try and delete the container, either in the graph API or the SharePoint Admin Center, you're going to get a friendly message saying, hey, wait a second, this has litigation hold applied to it. You're not going to be able to do that. So as you would expect, all the content is going to be on hold until that is released. As soon as it's released, then normal recycle bin activity happens. If it's older than 93 days, great, it's going to go and get deleted permanently. If it was within 93 days, then it's going to go into the recycle bin where it will sit until it executes and meets that 93-day condition. Okay. After you have that litigation hold applied, create a review set, create a collection, anything that you need to there, you'll be able to do normal e-discovery activity from the container that you now have placed into that e-discovery case. All right. Okay, I think that is good for collaboration and compliance. Reed, I'm going to hand it back over to you unless there are some probing questions.
You know what? If you have questions, add them in here to the discussion. I got to say, Steve, every time I see a full demo of the rich capabilities across compliance of M365, all I can think is I would never want to develop this myself.
Oh my gosh.
Can you imagine developing a file and document-centric app that you then also have to develop e-discovery for as part of what you're trying to do. And with SharePoint Embedded, it's just included in the thing.
How many thousand developers do you have, right?
Kind of
It's a
amazing,
time
yeah.
and money thing, and I've got an application that I want to get out to the marketplace. I want to be able to take advantage of what we've done. So
Yeah.
it's a beautiful thing.
Exactly. Okay.
You got it.
Well, thank you so much, Steve. And thanks everybody here with us. You know, we're doing this December super session as an experiment. We have done more demos, gone deeper, been a longer session. And so this will be just under 90 minutes, I think, by the time we're done. And I hope you found it useful. We'd love to hear any comments that you might have about the format. But, you know, as we wrap things up, I want to share a couple of getting started things with you. So one is you should definitely go over and take a look at our adoption page. This is our product detail page. It has that fantastic 2-minute video on it that I was talking about that's perfect for sharing with lots of people around your organization so that they can get an overview of what SharePoint Embedded is. And I want to make sure to share the pricing details. These are the published pricing details that we have. We have 3 meters that are important to SharePoint Embedded: storage, API transactions, and egress. I'm very excited to announce today that our egress price is actually going down. It is not 12 cents per gigabyte, it is 5 cents per gigabyte. Our adoption page just hasn't quite caught up yet, so stay tuned as we get that updated. But these are all very straightforward Azure meters. It is all subject to normal Azure agreements that you might have with Microsoft, like the Mac, etc. So definitely, if you think you're going to be building an app which manages files and documents, SharePoint Embedded is a fantastic choice, and it is fully Azure compliant. Now, I'd love it if you told your developers about SharePoint Embedded. So if you happen to be a technical decision maker or a business decision maker on the phone, you should tell your developers that they don't have to do it alone. They can harness SharePoint Embedded and have all the 4 C's that every file and document intensive application really does need to have. You get your separate resource limits, you get isolated permissions, you have integrated administration, and of course, you're working with the familiar Microsoft Graph API. Let's see. And then we have some, frequently asked questions. So we talked about this a little bit earlier around, when should I use SPO and when should I use SPE? SPO, great for when you need the SPO UX. SPE is great for when you want your own UX. There's also differences around security, etc. Do we support Power Platform and Dynamics integration? You can definitely connect to both platforms via existing APIs. So you saw Steve go deep inside his Power Platform demo app, which you can find over in our samples directory, by the way. Does SharePoint Embedded have the same malware and antivirus scanning as SharePoint? Yes, it does. Can you add guest users to a SharePoint Embedded container? You bet. There are some configuration restrictions around that if you don't want to be able to do that. And then do containers have both the first stage and second stage with the same 93-day rule? And no, it's just the first stage, as you saw Steve talk about there. And that's about it. So here are some ways that you can get started. We have, the self-service start. We have a customer connection program. This customer connection program is really great. It is run by one of our team members who unfortunately couldn't join us today, Tutu Abimbala, but she has been building a community of people who are doing things with SharePoint Embedded, and we engage with them all the time. So if you're interested in joining that and learning more about SharePoint Embedded along the way and how you might use it, you should hit that CCP sign-up link. And of course, if you're interested in joining the Copilot preview that Yogesh is running over here, you can hit this third link, the start-SPE-Copilot. And of course, we have all of our great sample apps that are available over on GitHub. And so I'm going to do one last refresh of the questions, see if we have anything else that we need to cover today. And it looks to me like we might. Yes, this is good. So the last question here is, could an app that uses SPE be publicly available so that users do not have to have a Microsoft account to use it? And I'm going to invite everybody to kind of come off mute and tell their perspective on this one, because this is actually a very nuanced question. And so in general, I would say you should not be using SPE for a public, unauthenticated website, for example. So that's one example where I would say it's not a fit. Steve, what's your take on this?
I would agree with you, Reed. If we start to share links with everyone that we have within the tenant, now we still maintain control of the content. We can apply all the governance that we talked about and just have a good, safe experience, right? When we start to create those links and make them public and share with 1,000 of our best friends, you start to lose control. So is there a small use case for that? We've seen some small use cases for that. Not something that we typically recommend. What a lot of people are very, very honed in on is, yes, they have sensitive documents. They want to maintain control of those, control that sharing experience. Entra is the way to do that. And also have that secure way for those to confirm who you are, just like any other sharing experience.
Right. Okay, good. Yogesh, what's your 1 minute take from a Copilot perspective? Love to hear it.
1 minute take is AI is powerful, and to deliver true value to your users, you really need to bring your organization skills and knowledge, and that takes experimentation. And I encourage you to start experimenting today and share your feedback. That's my take, because I apply that to my product making every day.
Got it. The one last thing that I will add in on this is that it's important to note that SharePoint Embedded does not require a fully licensed M365 user to do M365 collaboration. However, it does still require a user record. And so you might have, an external user, or you might have a user that is part of Entra but is not part of the M365 licensing, for example. And so you do have that capability. All right. I think with that, I think we can call this a very successful first super session. So thank you very much to everybody who dialed in from wherever you happen to be in the world. Really appreciate you taking the time to join us and spend some of your morning, afternoon, or evening with us. And thank you very much to Clarissa, Steve, Yogesh, and of course, our good friend Alan, who is helping us keep all the things on the rails. Look forward to our next super session in January, and we'll have news on that as we get closer. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.